He had everything: money, power, a mansion where nothing was missing, but he also had an emptiness, a silence that haunted him every day. His daughter had never spoken a word until a new nanny arrived and brought something that would change their home forever. Stay until the end, because this story will touch your heart. The iron gate opened slowly, revealing the impeccable facade of Marco Salgado's mansion. White marble gleamed under the morning sun. Large windows reflected the blue sky, and a meticulously trimmed garden surrounded the entrance as if each leaf had been positioned by hand. Everything there exuded perfection, except for what mattered most. Behind that architectural beauty was an emptiness, a silence that was anything but peaceful. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, that filled the corridors and seemed to echo off the walls. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort, but tightens the chest. Marco, at 42, walked through that entrance hall every day. He was a successful businessman, owner of a hotel chain, known for his coldness in negotiations and precision with numbers. Widowed for almost 3 years, he dedicated all his time outside of work to being at home, but he had never been able to break the barrier that existed between him and his only daughter. Alice, 6 years old, autistic and nonverbal, was his greatest love and at the same time his greatest pain. Since she was born, she had never uttered a single word. She communicated through gestures, expressions, and some brief sounds, but never with speech. Marco had grown used to conversing with her through his gaze, to interpreting her silences, to understanding the meaning of every hand movement, and yet he missed hearing her voice. Alice's routine was marked by small rituals that gave her security. In the morning, she would sit by the living room window, always holding the same cloth doll with worn stitching on its right arm, and watch the world outside. In the afternoon, she would spend a few minutes on the garden swing, feeling the wind on her face. At night, she would line up 3 colorful toy cars next to her bed before sleeping. If something interrupted these rituals, her world seemed to go off-kilter. Marco had tried everything: psychologists, therapists, speech pathologists, nannies specialized in caring for atypical children, but all attempts ended the same way, in quitting. Some left because they couldn't handle Alice's pace, others because they found it too difficult to interact with a child who didn't respond verbally. He had seen the frustrated expression of so many caregivers leaving through that door that he was no longer surprised. That day, the last of them, a woman in her early 50s, was saying goodbye at the gate. Marco, standing next to his daughter, watched without words. Alice, indifferent, squeezed her doll against her chest and looked away. The maid in the hallway approached him with a tone of caution. "Mr. Marco, should I call the agency?" He ran a hand through his hair, sighing. "Yes, it's better." In his office, with the curtains open, letting in the late afternoon light, Marco dialed a number he knew well. The receptionist answered by name. "Good afternoon, Mr. Salgado. Do you need a new employee?" "I do, but I'll warn you now, it won't be easy," he said, resting his elbow on the desk. "None of them last more than a few weeks." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "I understand, but I believe we might have someone who can adapt." "I've heard that before," he replied with a slight skepticism in his voice. "This young woman is different," the receptionist insisted. "She doesn't have a resume full of diplomas, but she knows how to listen. She worked with children at a music NGO and has her own way. Her name is Camila." Marco frowned. "Musical?" "Yes. She uses music to build bonds. And before you ask, it's not about teaching instruments or doing performances, it's about communication." He leaned back in his chair thoughtfully. Music. Alice had never shown much interest in sounds from devices or instruments, but sometimes she would sway her body slightly when the wind made the curtain move. Maybe it was a sign, or maybe not. "Send her over," he said finally. "Early tomorrow." After hanging up, he spent a few seconds looking at the framed photo on his desk. It showed him, his wife, and Alice still a baby in a park. The memory of his wife's laughter came like a quick breath. He pressed his lips together, moved the frame to the corner, and took a deep breath. Upstairs, Alice was sitting on the bedroom rug, lining up her colorful toy cars. Marco appeared in the doorway and leaned against the frame. "Someone new is coming to take care of you tomorrow," he said in a low voice, almost as if talking to himself. Alice didn't look up, finished lining up the last car, and went back to hugging her doll. Marco knew that the arrival of a new nanny wouldn't change his daughter overnight, but deep down, there was still a thread of hope left in him. The same thread that, despite so many disappointments, never completely broke. As he slowly closed the door, the corridor was silent again. A silence that, for years, he had tried to fill with words that were never answered. The next morning began with the soft sound of the gate opening. Marco, standing in the hall, watched a simple car park in front of the mansion. A young woman with calm steps got out, wearing dark jeans, a light cotton blouse and a light jacket. Over her shoulder was a cloth bag, and on her back, hanging by a worn strap, was a guitar. Marco slightly frowned. It wasn't the kind of arrival he expected. Most of the previous caregivers came carrying folders, documents, and educational toys. She stopped in front of the door and smiled. A calm smile without excess, like someone who already knows that rushing is useless when it comes to earning trust. "Good morning, Mr. Salgado," she said in a soft but firm voice. Marco responded with a nod, maintaining his formality. "You can call me Marco." She nodded and entered, her eyes scanning the room, not with the curiosity of an intruder, but with the care of someone who wants to understand the territory. "Alice is in the garden," Marco informed her, leading her down the corridor that led to the backyard. As they approached, they saw the girl sitting on the swing with the cloth doll in her lap. The wind gently moved Alice's light brown hair as she stared fixedly at the ground. Camilla stopped a few steps away. She didn't call the girl's name, didn't try to introduce herself immediately. She just took the guitar off her back, adjusted the strings, and began to strum simple notes, creating a soft melody, almost like a whisper. Marco, standing by the glass door, watched. He expected to see Alice completely ignore her presence. But, to his surprise, the girl looked up, not at Camilla, but at the hands moving over the strings. Camilla continued without changing the rhythm. Then she added her voice, a song with few repetitive words, almost a mantra. Alice swayed her body just once, in a movement so subtle that others might not have noticed. But Marco saw it. He knew his daughter's every gesture. Camilla finished the sequence and, without forcing it, put the guitar away. She let the silence return, but it was a different, less dense silence. "She likes music?" Marco asked, still intrigued. "She likes predictability," Camilla replied with a small smile. "Music is predictable. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. She can feel what's going to happen before it happens. That gives her security." Marco nodded, still unsure if it was a guess or real knowledge. For the rest of the morning, Camilla didn't try to make physical contact with Alice. She stayed nearby, helping to prepare a snack, observing the girl's movements, speaking little, but with a constant tone. At the end of the day, Marco realized that Alice had spent more time close to Camilla than to any other caregiver on their first day of work. There were no meltdowns or abrupt withdrawals, just a quiet coexistence, but without tension. At the time to leave, Camilla said goodbye to Marco at the door. "Tomorrow, I'll bring some things for our music corner." "Our corner?" he asked. "It's a space just for her, but where I can be with her. It doesn't need much, a mat, a guitar, maybe one or two simple instruments. The goal isn't to teach music, it's to create a place where she feels she can express herself in her own way." Marco watched her for a moment. "Have you worked with autistic children before?" "I grew up with one," she replied without hesitation. "My sister. She didn't speak either, but she sang. Marco was silent for a few seconds, absorbing that information. Camilla smiled slightly and went down the front steps. Marco stood there until he saw her disappear through the gate. He went back inside and found Alice still in the garden, swinging slowly with the doll in her lap. Maybe it was too early to expect miracles, but that day, for the first time in a long time, Marco felt that something different had happened. The second day began with the discreet sound of the gate opening. Marco was already in his office, but he watched from the window as Camilla entered, carrying a cloth bag and, as always, the guitar on her back. There was no rush in her steps. It was as if she had all the time in the world to get to the right moment. In the kitchen, she spread some objects on the table: a small tambourine, a seed rattle, 2 different-sized pots, and a colorful round mat. "What is all this?" Marco asked, curious as he entered. "Our music corner," she replied, as if it were the most obvious thing. "Today, I want to see if Alice chooses a sound to call her own." Alice was in the garden on the swing, as usual. Camilla didn't go to her immediately. She arranged the mat on the porch, placed the objects in a circle, and sat down. The guitar was propped up beside her. Then she began to tap the tambourine softly, in a slow, steady rhythm. Marco, watching from inside, noticed when Alice stopped swinging. Her eyes were fixed on the repetitive movement of Camilla's hands. For a few seconds, she seemed to be measuring the distance between where she was and that colorful circle. Camilla didn't call to her, she just continued. Then she swapped the tambourine for the rattle, producing a softer sound. Alice got off the swing, took a few steps, stopped, and started walking again. In a few minutes, she was standing a meter away from the mat. Camilla then picked up one of the pots and lightly tapped it with her fingertips. The sound was short but full. She looked at Alice and, without saying a word, pushed the pot to the edge of the mat. Alice crouched down, touched the edge of the object, then ran her hand over the cold bottom. Finally, she hit it once with her palm. The sound came out deeper. "Yes," Camilla said in a whisper, as if confirming she was listening. Marco felt something tighten in his chest. This wasn't speaking, but it was communication. And coming from Alice, each gesture carried immense weight. The morning continued like this, with Camilla alternating sounds and pauses, and Alice participating shyly but present. When the nanny picked up the guitar, Alice didn't retreat. On the contrary, she sat on the mat, touching her feet to hers. Camilla began a new melody, invented right there with 3 notes and a slow rhythm. She sang prolonged vowels. From the doorway, Marco saw when Alice, still looking at the guitar, moved her lips. No word came out, but an almost inaudible sound escaped. A try, an opening. Camilla didn't celebrate excessively, she just kept the music going, as if that sound were natural there. Alice repeated it once more, a little more audibly. Then she leaned her head on Camilla's shoulder. Marco had to lean on the doorframe to keep himself from rushing forward and spoiling the moment. That was the first sign, small but so powerful that it seemed to fill the air with another kind of silence. Not the heavy kind, but the expectant kind. When the afternoon ended, Camilla put the instruments away and said goodbye. Alice walked her to the door, not touching her but walking side by side. Marco noticed, closed the door, and looked at his daughter. "You liked her, didn't you?" Alice hugged the doll against her chest and went back to the hallway. Marco smiled to himself. Perhaps for the first time in years, he had seen a crack in the wall that surrounded his daughter's voice. A few days later, the afternoon was grey, and a fine rain fell on the mansion's garden. The sound of drops hitting the leaves was the only noise besides the distant ticking of a clock in the hallway. Alice was in the living room, sitting near the window with the doll in her lap. The world outside seemed slow, as if waiting for something. Camilla arrived a little after 3 with the guitar protected by a plastic case. She also brought a small, rolled-up, colorful cloth, a long, soft scarf. Marco was in his office reviewing reports, but he noticed the sound of her footsteps echoing through the hall. He didn't ask anything, just watched, as she crossed the corridor and went to Alice. Camilla didn't ask questions. She took the guitar out of its case, placed it on her lap, and began to tune the strings, the sound mixing with the rain. Then she sat on the floor, near the window, a meter away from Alice. She pulled the scarf out and put it over her shoulders, letting the ends fall to the mat. Alice looked quickly, then returned her gaze to the doll. Camilla began to strum a slow melody, repeating 3 chords. There was no rush. Between one sequence and another, she sang short, soft words, house, light, wind. After each repetition, she paused, leaving a space. Alice swayed her body slightly. Camilla then extended the scarf toward her, without touching, just offering it. The girl hesitated, but reached out and took one of the ends. "Yes," Camilla murmured, maintaining the rhythm. Marco, from upstairs, heard the music. Curious, he went to the mezzanine railing. From there, he had a partial view of the living room. He leaned against the wood, hiding so as not to interrupt. Camilla was now singing about gestures. "Hold on, look, breathe." Alice began to imitate, holding the end of the scarf firmly, looking at her face, breathing in the same rhythm. It was like a silent dance. The music changed its tone, becoming sweeter, more engaging. Then suddenly something happened. In the improvised chorus, Camilla sang, "I'm going home," and Alice, with a voice almost trembling, articulated the syllables, "Homie." Marco stood still. The sound was low, but clear. His heart raced. He pressed his hands against the railing to keep from running to them. Camilla didn't stop. She repeated the phrase, encouraging her. "I'm going home," Alice repeated. "Homie." This time it was firmer. The sound echoed differently in that room. It was as if the silence had given way, broken into pieces to make room for something new. Camilla smiled but continued naturally without exaggerating her reaction. She knew that each new word needed to come in the girl's own time. Marco, from above, fought back tears. He had never heard his daughter's voice. At the end of the song, Alice let go of her doll, leaving it on the floor, and stood up. She walked to Camilla, still holding the end of the scarf. She stopped in front of her, looked up, and said almost in a whisper, "Dad." Marco couldn't resist anymore. He ran down the steps quickly, the sound of his shoes on the wood. When he reached the living room, Alice ran to him. He knelt down and she hugged him, pressing her face against his chest. "I'm here, my daughter," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Camilla stepped back a little, leaving the moment just for the two of them. She stood up, watching with a discreet smile. She knew she had witnessed something no technique could guarantee, Alice's choice to use her voice. Marco held his daughter in his arms, feeling her warmth and weight. There were no words that could translate that moment. He knew there would still be difficult days, that progress wouldn't be linear, but nothing would take away the memory of the first dad he heard. When they separated, Alice looked at Camilla and lightly tugged on the scarf, as if to say, "Continue." Camilla sat down again, strummed the same chords, and together they resumed the melody, this time with Marco sitting beside them, accompanying the rhythm with soft claps. The rain outside seemed lighter, the house more alive. The rain from the night before had given way to a sunny day. Rays of light pierced through the light curtains, forming patterns on the living room floor. Marco was in the kitchen preparing coffee, and with every step he took, he felt something different in the air. It wasn't just the change in weather. It was as if the house had gained a new sound since the previous afternoon, a sound he still couldn't get tired of remembering, his daughter's voice. Alice appeared in the hallway holding her doll. Seeing him, she didn't say anything, but she came to the table and pulled up the chair next to him. Marco smiled, poured her some milk, and cut a slice of bread for her. Before taking a bite, the girl looked at him and, in a low voice, articulated, "Dad." He stopped his movement, swallowing the emotion before it overflowed. He just replied, "Yes, my daughter." Camilla arrived shortly after, bringing the guitar again. Alice stood up, went to the door and greeted her with a light touch on her hand. It was a rare gesture, but full of meaning. Camilla smiled and took a small drum from her bag. "Today we're going to try a new sound." The rest of the morning was filled with small melodies and repetitions of words. Water, more, ball. Marco watched from a distance without interfering, as he had learned to do in recent days. In the early afternoon, he took time off from work and went with them to a music store. He wanted Alice to have her own guitar, even a smaller one. On the way back, she looked at the instrument on her lap, running her fingers over the strings without producing sound, just feeling the vibration. At home, Camilla created a new routine. Each activity would have an anchor song, simple and short. The song for a snack had the names of the foods, the one for the bath had sounds of water and foam, and the one for sleeping had long, slow notes. Marco also began to participate, even without musical ability. The important thing was to maintain the rhythm and predictability. As the days passed, Alice began to hum parts of the songs by herself, especially when she was in the garden. The swing, which used to be a place of isolation, became a stage for her first vocal initiatives. Camilla encouraged, but never pressured. Marco increasingly understood that the secret was not to rush the process, but to be present for when it happened. A few weeks later, Marco noticed another change. Alice, who had previously avoided eye contact, began to hold his gaze for longer. One day, at the end of a song, she looked at him and said, "Together." It was just one word, but he felt as if it were a whole sentence. At the end of one afternoon, Camilla suggested a picnic in the garden. They spread out a blanket, fruits, juice, and some bread. The sun was slowly setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. Camilla picked up the guitar, tuned the strings, and began to play the same melody that had broken the silence weeks earlier. Marco sat next to Alice, who held her doll with one hand and his arm with the other. When Camilla started singing the chorus, Alice joined in. This time, her voice came out firmer, more confident. Marco sang along, forming a trio that seemed to defy the silence that had once dominated that house. When the music ended, Alice let go of her doll on the grass and lay on her back, looking at the sky. "Pretty sky," she said clearly. Marco was silent for a moment, just admiring. Every word from her was like a gift he never imagined he would receive. Camilla collected the guitar and discreetly moved away, leaving father and daughter in that intimate moment. Marco lay down next to Alice, imitating her position, and together they watched the clouds change shape. There was no hurry or fear of the silence returning. Now that silence had another meaning. It was a comfortable silence, filled with what had already been said. When it got dark, they packed everything up and went back inside. Alice went into her room, arranged her 3 colorful toy cars on the shelf, as she always did before bed, and then returned to the living room. She approached Marco, hugged him and said, "Good night, Dad." He hugged her back, feeling his throat tighten. "Good night, my daughter." As she went up the stairs, Marco looked at Camilla, who was collecting the picnic blanket. "I don't know how to thank you," Camilla smiled. "You don't need to thank me. I just sang." She was the one who decided to speak. Marco knew it was true, but he also knew that without Camilla, that moment might never have happened. Life didn't turn into a fairy tale overnight. There were still difficult days, silent moments, meltdowns that required patience. But now there were also laughs, loose words, and songs that echoed through the corridors. The house was no longer the same, not because the furniture had changed, but because the voices, especially Alice's, were now a part of it. That night, before sleeping, Marco stayed in the garden for a few minutes. He remembered the day he saw her speak for the first time, and how that instant transformed everything. He realized that sometimes it's not force or insistence that opens a door, it's care, presence, the right melody played at the right time. Sometimes life teaches us that love isn't in words, but in the patience of waiting for them to blossom. Marco spent years wanting to hear his daughter's voice. He looked for quick solutions, ready-made methods, answers that would come quickly. But it was in the right time that the first word was born. Camilla didn't arrive with promises, she arrived with presence. She showed that care isn't about imposing, it's about offering a safe space for the other person to be who they are. And Alice, she didn't just speak, she showed that every achievement, no matter how small it seems, carries a whole world of meaning within it. Because some voices don't need to be called out, they need to be welcomed until they are ready to be born. And it wasn't just one song that changed everything, it was the discovery that love and patience can open doors that no one else can. The millionaire understood that what his daughter needed wasn't more doctors, more money, or more rules, but rather someone who saw her for who she really is. And alongside the new nanny, he learned that true connections are built in silence, with respect and at the right time. Because in the end, the greatest wealth anyone can have is finding someone who can finally give their world a voice. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and share it with someone who will also be moved. Write in the comments what part stood out to you the most and what lesson you take from this story. Feel free to tell us what place you are following us from. And of course, subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this, full of emotion and reflection. Until next time.